Welcome to the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner Prepcast, where we guide you through everything you need to know for your certification exam. Whether you're just starting or looking to refine your knowledge, this course will set you up for success. Brought to you by baremetalcyber.com. Let's get started. The principle of least privilege is often described as the North Star of access control in AWS. It provides a simple but powerful guideline. Every identity, whether a person, role, or service, should have only the permissions it absolutely needs and nothing more. By limiting permissions tightly, organizations reduce the risk of accidental misuse, security breaches, and regulatory violations. On the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner exam, you'll often encounter this principle because it underpins nearly all security best practices. In the real world, it ensures that even if one account is compromised, the damage remains limited. At its core, least privilege relies on AWS's default deny model. By default, all requests in AWS are denied unless explicitly allowed by a policy. This means that administrators must carefully grant permissions through IAM or resource-based policies. Explicit deny statements can further block access, even if another policy grants it. For exam preparation, remember that the combination of default deny and explicit allow creates a secure baseline where nothing happens unless clearly authorized. AWS supports both identity-based and resource-based policies. Identity-based policies are attached to users, groups, or roles, defining what actions they can take. Resource-based policies are attached to AWS resources themselves, such as S3 bucket policies that specify who can access objects. Both models work together to enforce least privilege. For example, an S3 bucket may deny public access by default, while an IAM policy grants access only to a specific role. On the exam, remember the difference. Identity-based policies define what an identity can do, while resource-based policies define who can use a resource. Permissions are scoped using the action and resource elements within a policy. The action specifies what can be done, such as SORAY, get object, and the resource specifies what it applies to, such as a particular S3 bucket or object. By combining these two, administrators can create precise rules. For example, a developer might be allowed to list objects in one bucket but not delete them. On the exam, remember that specifying both action and resource tightly enforces least privilege. Conditions provide even finer control over permissions. Using condition keys, administrators can restrict access based on context such as IP address, time of day, or whether MFA is enabled. For example, a policy might allow access only if the request comes from the corporate network. This reduces risk by enforcing controls that go beyond basic actions and resources. For exam preparation, know that conditions add another layer of precision to least privilege policies. IAM roles are preferred over long-lived IAM users and access keys. Roles provide temporary credentials through AWS STS, reducing the risk of exposure. For example, an EC2 instance can assume a role to access S3 without needing hard-coded access keys. By contrast, long-lived users and keys create vulnerabilities, if not rotated or removed. On the exam, remember that roles align better with least privilege because they provide temporary, scoped credentials. Group-based permission management is another best practice. Instead of assigning policies to individual users, administrators place users into groups and assign policies at the group level. This reduces errors, simplifies auditing, and ensures consistency. For example, a developers group might have access to testing resources, while a finance group has permissions for billing. On the exam, know that groups improve governance by standardizing permissions. Managed policies serve as a useful starting point. AWS provides a library of managed policies for common roles, such as Amazon S3 read-only access. These policies provide a baseline but are often too broad to meet strict least privilege requirements. Organizations should refine access further with custom policies tailored to their needs. For the exam, remember that AWS managed policies are convenient, but least privilege often requires narrowing them. Separating duties and creating break glass access patterns is another way to implement least privilege. Separation of duties means no one person has unchecked power. For example, one role may approve spending while another deploys infrastructure. A break glass role is a highly privileged role reserved for emergencies and accessed under strict approval. On the exam, know that separation of duties and break glass roles prevent abuse and reduce risk. Permissions boundaries help cap the maximum permissions an IAM identity can have. Even if a user is assigned multiple policies, the permissions boundary acts as a ceiling, preventing escalation beyond it. For example, a contractor might be limited by a boundary that blocks administrative actions, even if they are mistakenly given a broader policy. For the exam, remember that permissions boundaries set limits on identities and enforce least privilege by design. Service control policies, or SCPs, extend least privilege across an entire organization. SCPs allow administrators to define guardrails at the account or organizational unit level. For example, an SCP might block all accounts from launching resources outside approved regions. SCPs ensure that least privilege is enforced at scale, not just within individual accounts. For exam preparation, know that SCPs apply across accounts in AWS organizations and restrict maximum permissions. Access Analyzer is a tool that helps detect overly broad access. It analyzes policies for resources like S3, IAM roles, or KMS keys and flags when they are accessible from outside the account. For example, it can identify if an S3 bucket is unintentionally public. This proactive check supports least privilege by highlighting risks. On the exam, remember that Access Analyzer detects overly permissive policies and helps organizations tighten security. Finally, logging validates whether least privilege assumptions hold true. CloudTrail records all API activity, and Access Advisor shows when permissions were last used. By reviewing these logs, administrators can remove unused permissions and refine policies. For example, if a user never invokes S3 delete object, that permission can be safely removed. On the exam, know that logging and analysis are essential to maintaining least privilege over time. For more cyber-related content and books, please check out cyberauthor.me. Also, there are other prepcasts on cybersecurity and more at baremetalcyber.com. Attribute-Based Access Control, or ABAC, is one of the newer ways AWS supports least privilege. Instead of hard-coding permissions for specific users, ABAC uses tags as attributes to control access. For example, a developer tagged with Project Alpha can only access resources with the same tag. This makes policies more dynamic, since permissions automatically adjust as tags are applied. For the exam, remember that ABAC enforces least privilege by tying access rights to resource and identity tags rather than fixed policies. Time-boxed and task-based access is another method to reduce risk. Using AWS STS, administrators can grant temporary permissions for specific tasks. For example, a contractor may receive credentials that last only a few hours to complete maintenance. Once expired, those credentials cannot be reused. This prevents long-term exposure and enforces just-in-time access. On the exam, know that STS supports temporary scoped permissions that align with least privilege. A denialist approach can also enforce least privilege, especially for restricted services or regions. Policies can explicitly deny launching instances in regions outside of business operations, or deny access to services not needed by a team. For example, an SCP could block all accounts from creating resources in non-compliant regions. On the exam, remember that explicit denies are stronger than allows and can be used to enforce boundaries. Policy versioning and change control are part of maintaining least privilege over time. Policies evolve as organizations grow, but without versioning, changes may accidentally broaden permissions. By keeping versioned policies and using change approval processes, administrators ensure access remains appropriate. For the exam, understand that least privilege requires not just initial design but ongoing control of policy changes. Another best practice is to use the narrowest resource Amazon resource name, or RN, possible. Instead of granting access to all objects in a bucket, a policy might grant access only to one specific folder or file. Similarly, permissions for DynamoDB might be scoped to a single table rather than the entire service. On the exam, remember that using precise ARNs enforces least privilege by limiting scope tightly. Avoiding wildcards in policies is another crucial step. While it may be tempting to use, quote, to allow all actions or all resources, this undermines least privilege. Instead, critical actions should be enumerated explicitly, even if it requires more effort. For example, granting S3 is far too broad, while listing only S3 get object and S3 put object keeps access restricted. On the exam, expect to see wildcard usage identified as an over-permissioned pattern. Guardrails should apply to both console and programmatic access. IAM policies, SCPs, and permissions boundaries can ensure that whether users interact through the AWS console or APIs, they are equally restricted. For example, if deleting S3 buckets is prohibited, it must be prohibited regardless of access method. On the exam, remember that least privilege applies consistently across all forms of access. Reviewing unused permissions is another best practice. AWS provides last used data for IAM permissions, showing which actions were actually invoked. If permissions remain unused over time, they can be removed to tighten policies. For example, if a developer never uses EC2 terminate instances, that permission can be revoked. On the exam, know that reviewing and removing unused permissions is part of maintaining least privilege. Automating least privilege policy generation helps reduce human error. AWS IAM Access Analyzer can suggest policies based on observed activity, creating tailored policies that grant only the permissions actually used. This helps avoid over-permissioning when writing policies manually. For exam purposes, remember that automation supports least privilege by generating right-sized policies. Education is just as important as technology. Teams should be trained to request only the access they need and to expect just-in-time rights rather than blanket permissions. This cultural shift reinforces security practices and prevents the push for convenience at the expense of security. On the exam, remember that least privilege is not only about technical controls but also about shaping team behavior. Access reviews should be tied to audits and compliance processes. Regular reviews ensure that permissions remain aligned with job functions and regulatory requirements. For example, quarterly reviews might confirm that contractors' accounts have been disabled and that employees have only the access they need. On the exam, know that access reviews reinforce least privilege through governance. From an exam perspective, be prepared to identify over-permissioned patterns. Scenarios may include wildcard usage, lack of conditions, or assigning administrator rights unnecessarily. The correct answer will usually involve refining the policy to make it narrower and more specific. By recognizing risky patterns, you can apply least privilege principles to propose safer alternatives. Finally, least privilege is a journey of continuous improvement. Monitoring logs, analyzing policy usage, and refining access controls ensure that permissions remain aligned with evolving needs. AWS tools like CloudTrail, Access Analyzer, and IAM reports provide feedback that can be used to adjust policies. On the exam, remember that least privilege is not static. It requires ongoing monitoring and refinement. As we close this episode, remember that the principle of least privilege reduces the blast radius of any compromise and simplifies compliance audits. By granting only necessary permissions, avoiding wildcards, using temporary roles, and regularly reviewing access, organizations strengthen their security posture. For exam preparation, focus on recognizing policies that are too broad and knowing which AWS tools enforce least privilege. In practice, Applying this principle everywhere creates safer, more resilient cloud environments. That concludes today's episode of the AWS Certified Cloud Practitioner Prepcast. Be sure to tune in for the next episode and visit us online at baremetalcyber.com or cyberauthor.me for more resources, including news, mailing lists, YouTube videos, podcasts, and much more.